Friedrich Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morality, published in 1887, is one of his most critical works on ethics, psychology, and human nature. This text comprises 3 essays, each of which seeks to explore the origins of morality and how moral values have evolved in Western society. Nietzsche's central claim is that what we consider morality is not an eternal, universal truth but a historical construct developed through power dynamics, human resentment, and social manipulation. Below is a structured and detailed exploration of the key concepts in On the Genealogy of Morality, with examples, quotes, explanations, relevance to everyday life, and critiques. Master morality versus slave morality. One of Nietzsche's most famous distinctions is between master morality and slave morality, which he outlines in the first essay of On the Genealogy of Morality. He argues that moral values developed historically through a power struggle between 2 groups, the strong, noble class, masters, and the oppressed, weaker class, slaves. Key quote, "The noble type of man feels himself as a determiner of values, he does not need approval, he judges, what is harmful to me is harmful in itself, he knows himself to be that which first accords honor to things, he creates values." On the Genealogy of Morality, first essay. Explanation: In master morality, the strong and noble define their own values based on power, strength, and vitality. For the master, what is good is whatever enhances life, power, and assertiveness, and what is bad is weakness, cowardice, and submission. This morality is life-affirming, rooted in self-confidence, and a desire to dominate. By contrast, slave morality emerges from the ressentiment, of the weak toward the strong. Unable to express power themselves, the weak label their oppressors as evil and redefine their own qualities, humility, meekness, and suffering, as good. Slave morality, therefore, is reactive and life-denying, as it elevates weakness and self-denial while demonizing strength and power. Example: An example of master morality might be an ancient warrior class that values honor, bravery, and victory in battle. In contrast, a religious movement that preaches humility, forgiveness, and turning the other cheek in the face of violence exemplifies slave morality. Christianity, Nietzsche argues, arose as a form of slave morality by glorifying meekness and suffering, in opposition to the Greco-Roman master morality of strength and dominance. Everyday relevance: This distinction challenges contemporary moral standards that often celebrate values like humility, patience, and self-sacrifice. Nietzsche encourages individuals to critically evaluate whether they are adopting values out of weakness or resentment, or whether they are creating values that reflect strength, creativity, and life affirmation. Criticism: Critics argue that Nietzsche's division between master and slave morality is too simplistic and overlooks the complexities of human ethics. Philosopher Alistair MacIntyre points out that Nietzsche's valorization of master morality risks promoting an elitist or even authoritarian worldview, where the powerful justify their dominance as inherently good. Ressentiment, and the birth of morality. In the first essay, Nietzsche introduces the concept of ressentiment, a form of deep-seated resentment or hostility that arises from feelings of inferiority or powerlessness. He argues that slave morality is born out of ressentiment because the weak, unable to exert power, create moral systems that devalue the qualities of their oppressors. Key quote: "The slave revolt in morality begins when ressentiment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values, the ressentiment of natures that are denied the true reaction, that have deeds, and compensate themselves with an imaginary revenge." On the Genealogy of Morality, first essay. Explanation: Ressentiment is a psychological reaction to being oppressed or dominated. Instead of confronting the powerful, the weak internalize their suffering and invent moral values that justify their position as virtuous. This is how concepts like humility, meekness, and self-sacrifice become moral ideals in slave morality, while the power and dominance of the master class are labeled as evil. This dynamic, according to Nietzsche, is the origin of Christian morality, which he views as a slave revolt against the noble values of antiquity. Example: in modern times, ressentiment can be seen in various social or political movements where those who feel marginalized demonize the success or strength of others. Nietzsche would argue that these movements often do not seek to uplift themselves through self-affirmation, but instead focus on bringing down those in positions of power. Everyday relevance: Nietzsche's concept of ressentiment invites individuals to reflect on whether their moral judgments stem from personal empowerment or from a sense of victimhood and envy. In daily life, it can encourage people to adopt more proactive and self-affirming attitudes rather than defining themselves in opposition to those they perceive as more powerful. Criticism: while Nietzsche's analysis of ressentiment provides a powerful critique of moral systems, some critics believe it risks ignoring the valid grievances of oppressed groups. Slavoj Žižek, for instance, argues that Nietzsche's dismissal of ressentiment fails to account for the ways in which rebellion and critique of power can be a force for justice and positive social change. Guilt, bad conscience, and the ascetic ideal. In the second and third essays, Nietzsche explores the origins of guilt, the bad conscience, and the ascetic ideal, the value system that elevates self-denial and suffering as moral goods. He traces these concepts back to the development of civilization, where the suppression of human instincts gave rise to feelings of guilt and a bad conscience. Key quote: "The bad conscience is an illness, there is no doubt about that, but an illness as pregnancy is an illness." On the Genealogy of Morality, second essay. Explanation: Nietzsche argues that as humans transition from a more instinctual, pre-civilized existence to one dominated by societal rules and laws, they had to suppress their natural drives and instincts. This repression gave birth to the bad conscience, a sense of guilt or self-loathing directed inward. Instead of expressing aggression outward, as in master morality, the individual turns it inward, leading to guilt and self-punishment. The ascetic ideal, particularly in religious contexts, glorifies suffering, self-denial, and the rejection of worldly pleasures. Nietzsche sees this as a further extension of slave morality, where life-denying values are upheld as virtuous. In particular, he critiques Christianity's focus on self-sacrifice, humility, and the afterlife, which he argues distracts people from living fully and authentically in the present. Example: many religious traditions promote fasting, celibacy, and self-denial as moral practices. Nietzsche would argue that these practices are rooted in the ascetic ideal, which prioritizes suffering and self-sacrifice over the natural human instincts for pleasure and vitality. For Nietzsche, such practices reinforce the bad conscience by teaching people to feel guilty for their desires. Everyday relevance: Nietzsche's critique of guilt and the ascetic ideal challenges modern views on self-discipline, sacrifice, and moral self-denial. People who feel guilt or shame over their desires and ambitions may find Nietzsche's ideas liberating, as they offer a framework for embracing life's pleasures and rejecting life-denying moral codes. Criticism: Nietzsche's attack on guilt and the ascetic ideal has been criticized for dismissing the value of self-discipline and moral restraint. Critics argue that some level of self-denial is necessary for personal growth and social cohesion. Additionally, Nietzsche's critique of Christianity's moral framework has been seen by religious scholars as overly reductive, failing to acknowledge the positive aspects of spiritual discipline. The will to power and its role in morality. Throughout On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche alludes to his concept of the will to power, the fundamental drive that he believes underlies all human action and moral systems. For Nietzsche, all forms of morality, whether master or slave, are expressions of the will to power. Key quote: "Man would rather will nothingness than not will." On the Genealogy of Morality, third essay. Explanation: the will to power is Nietzsche's idea that humans are primarily driven by a desire to assert their strength, overcome obstacles, and impose their values on the world. Morality, in this view, is not about discovering some universal truth, but about the expression of power. Master morality expresses the will to power through domination and creation, while slave morality expresses it through reactive means, by condemning and reshaping the values of the strong. Even the ascetic ideal, Nietzsche argues, is an expression of the will to power, but in a distorted form. The ascetic priest, for example, gains power by preaching self-denial and suffering, manipulating others into following his moral framework. Example: consider a powerful political leader who imposes their vision of justice and morality on a society. Nietzsche would argue that this is a clear expression of the will to power, where the leader is shaping the world according to their values. Similarly, a religious leader who encourages followers to reject worldly pleasures and embrace suffering is also exercising the will to power, but through a different, life-denying method. Everyday relevance: Nietzsche's concept of the will to power encourages people to view their actions, ambitions, and even moral beliefs as expressions of their desire to exert influence on the world. Understanding this can help individuals become more conscious of their motivations and strive to channel their will to power in productive, life-affirming ways. Criticism: Nietzsche's emphasis on the will to power has been criticized for potentially justifying authoritarianism or the imposition of one's values over others. Some scholars, such as Bertrand Russell, argue that Nietzsche's philosophy can be used to rationalize domination and exploitation, particularly in political contexts. However, Nietzsche's idea of the will to power is not necessarily about brute force but can also be expressed through creativity, art, and personal development. The future of morality, beyond good and evil. On the genealogy of morality, Nietzsche concludes by pointing toward a future where humanity transcends traditional moral binaries of good and evil. He envisions a new form of morality that is more life-affirming and rooted in creativity and strength rather than in guilt, resentment, and self-denial. Key quote: "What is our morality today? It is a more refined and spiritualized cruelty." On the Genealogy of Morality, 3rd essay. Explanation: Nietzsche believes that modern morality, even in its secular forms, continues to perpetuate the same life-denying values found in Christianity. He argues that morality has become a form of cruelty, where people suppress their instincts and desires in favor of abstract ideals of good and evil. For Nietzsche, the future of morality lies in moving beyond these categories and embracing a more affirmative and creative way of life. This new morality would be centered on the individual's capacity for self-overcoming, and the creation of personal values, rather than adherence to universal moral codes. Nietzsche's vision for the future is one in which people no longer feel guilt or shame for their natural instincts but instead celebrate their strength, creativity, and vitality. Example: in a world where people often feel constrained by societal expectations of what it means to be good or successful, Nietzsche's philosophy encourages a radical rethinking of personal values. For instance, an artist who breaks with tradition and creates controversial or avant-garde work embodies Nietzsche's call to go beyond conventional morality and create new values. Everyday relevance: Nietzsche's call to move beyond good and evil resonates with contemporary ideas of self-actualization and personal freedom. It challenges individuals to define their own values and to live authentically, rather than conforming to societal expectations or inherited moral codes. Criticism: critics of Nietzsche's vision for the future of morality argue that his rejection of universal values could lead to moral chaos or nihilism. Without shared moral standards, how can society ensure justice or prevent harm? Nietzsche's defenders, however, argue that his philosophy is not about the rejection of morality altogether but about creating new, life-affirming values that promote human flourishing. Conclusion: relevance of On the Genealogy of Morality in Everyday Life. Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morality is a profound and often provocative work that challenges many of the assumptions underlying Western moral thought. By tracing the origins of morality to power dynamics, ressentiment, and the suppression of natural instincts, Nietzsche invites readers to critically reassess the values they live by and to consider the possibility of creating new, life-affirming values that reflect personal strength and creativity. In everyday life, Nietzsche's ideas encourage individuals to question inherited moral frameworks, examine the psychological roots of their values, and strive for self-overcoming. While his critiques of guilt, Christianity, and slave morality may be controversial, they offer a valuable perspective for those seeking greater autonomy and personal growth. However, Nietzsche's philosophy also raises important ethical questions, particularly about the balance between individual freedom and social responsibility, which continue to provoke debate among scholars and readers alike. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you appreciate the video and keep updated on our upcoming content.